Skill-based damage. Now, I've seen this word and this phrase all over the internet over the last couple of weeks, and it seems to crop up whenever Call of Duty release a brand new game. For those of you who are unaware, skill-based damage is this idea that Call of Duty has the capability to change how much damage your character does every single time you play a game. The idea being that if you're a high-skill player, maybe they'll nerf you mid-round, and if you're a low-skill player, maybe they'll give you some secret buffs. But is there any merit to this conversation? I mean, if you look online, you would assume that this is 100% factual and definitely does exist. And much like the last couple of deep dives I've decided to do, my brain simply couldn't say no. And if you've wondered how many times someone can die in a private match, the answer is pretty much infinite. So today we're going to get to the bottom of skill-based damage. And if you like this video, drop a like, consider subscribing as well. We're on the road to 200k, and it supports me, a youngling Call of Duty channel, growing in the first-person shooter space. These videos do generally take some testing, and quite frankly, I didn't know how bored I could get shooting a private match player several thousand times, but the answer is surprisingly high. From a conceptual standpoint, skill-based damage makes perfect sense, in the sense that Call of Duty has done their best to maximize player retention for as long as humanly possible, and if there was a way to further that goal, chances are they would probably engage in it. We all know that skill-based matchmaking is a thing. We all know for a fact that they have released actual detailed papers explaining that the whole reason for it is to increase player retention. And generally speaking, the golden word of player retention is why Call of Duty do most things. If it increases retention, it likely increases skin sales or weapon sales or whatever it so happens to be. So it really isn't a far cry that audiences would believe that if it were available to them, Call of Duty would do more things to rig the system. Now, this genuinely does exist as a pattern, and you can find it online yourself. Generally speaking, Call of Duty did at one point, long ago, back in 2017, before the internet poisoned our minds and we all got locked indoors for a bit, did file a patent for this. They very detailedly explained that they wanted a system, or potentially could develop a system, where they changed the general outcome in a video game space to improve player retention. They even give an example in this pattern of a high-skill player, a medium-skill player, and a low-skill player, and use certain variables like the degree of accuracy required to hit a target, the likelihood of being targeted by an enemy, the difficulty of an in-game puzzle, the bonus chance of finding good loot, the amount of friendly fire damage you might deal to teammates, and generally speaking, the high-skill player gets all of the odds stacked against them, and the low-skill to medium-skill players seemingly get an easier ride. Now, this existed back in 2017, and it was published by Google, and it was abandoned. And patents can be abandoned for a number of reasons. Generally speaking, a patent is just an idea of protecting yourself whenever you create something new or develop something that you feel is unique. And that could be abandoned because you think it's financially not viable, it's something that's too difficult to develop, or it's just because you don't think it's something that you can patent and actually have any legal grounds to defend yourself with. So at a very basic level, it isn't a huge surprise that the Call of Duty community jumped on this, especially when stuff like friendly fire and accuracy were included in this original patent that was posted online. So I decided, hey, why not? Let's test it. I don't necessarily think this is real, but I'm gonna give it a go myself. And that included both private matches and public matches, because generally speaking, the difficulty of these patterns and their parameters is that it would be tied to engagement-based metrics. So something like this maybe probably wouldn't work in a private match, but probably would function in something like a skill-based environment, because it simply makes sense. I did this with an account that had a 0.3 KD, an account that had a 1 KD, an account that had a 2 KD, and I threw them into a bunch of different games, managed to use a time of day where I could get lots of accounts into the same match. Please don't ask me why I was awake at 4 o'clock in the morning, and tried to gather as much data as humanly possible as to whether or not there were ever any inconsistencies in the damage being dealt. And then I did a little bit in private matches as well, just in case, to see if there was any kind of instance or indication that any of those 3 accounts would be treated differently in any kind of multiplayer environment. From all of this, I learned a couple of things. 1. Call of Duty lobbies at 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning are a very surreal experience, and I recommend everybody try them at least once. 2, you'd be very much astonished how much skill-based matchmaking is affected by the player population, and if you play before 5 o'clock or play at a really unholy hour, it tends to go quite well in your favor. And 3, after killing as many people as humanly possible with the same identical XM4 assault rifle, I didn't find a single instance of skill-based damage. But, let me make this clear, that doesn't mean there aren't inconsistencies. The first major inconsistency I noticed across the board with general bullet damage and general bullet registration that wasn't skill-based is just that Call of Duty servers are not nearly as functional as some people think they are. Depending on the region of the world you're in, Call of Duty generally fairly consistently will jump you from server to server unless it feels that your ping is going to be very harshly hurt. As a player who plays in London, my lowest ping is 1 to 2 milliseconds, and I can actually get a 2 ping server here in London, and if you're wondering why I'm in a basement of an Amazon warehouse, now you have the answer. Now, generally, Call of Duty is fine by sending me as far as 44 ping in the grand scheme of things, and that tends to be a distant east server, or usually one of the Spanish servers. But servers are a little bit more complex than that, and how your data travels from server to server can depend on your ISP's routing, it can depend on the connection to Call of Duty servers, it can depend on the routing that that connection takes to get to said server, and it can be a very messy equation. And all it takes is a little bit of packet burst, a little bit of packet loss, a little bit of your ISP stuttering, and if you're not on Ethernet, I'm telling you that happens far more than you think it does, and you can get a fairly inconsistent experience. I have an Ethernet system and generally have very little problem with hit reg, generally have very little problems with how servers operate. But if you go up to Wi-Fi, even if the router's in your damn room, I promise you you're going to get inconsistencies here and there just on the basis of Wi-Fi connectivity and just on the basis of the fact that hardware is imperfect. So even in your own house, there may be problems there. Problem 2 is that Call of Duty servers do have hiccups, much like most other video games, and in fact, I did an entire video covering how general hit registration in Call of Duty can be a little bit questionable in places. Now granted, since I made that video, the situation generally seems to have improved, but that isn't always the case, and you can play Call of Duty Warzone right now at peak hours from 5 PM onwards and watch their servers literally have a panic attack at any given equation. Now, I would assume that Call of Duty changes their general priority of servers, I would assume that they scale server demand up and down, and I would say that they probably have high-quality servers with good processors and bad-quality servers with terrible processors. And chances are, all of that can create some pretty wild inconsistencies, even on Warzone. So it's not so much that there is skill-based damage, but rather that there's just generally pretty large variances and inconsistencies of people's experiences. And that applies quite a lot if you're in North America. You would think in North America that generally speaking internet connections would be fine. That's not the case. American ISPs are utterly horrific, and I mean generally very bad ISPs, and if you're somebody who exists in Europe or Northern Europe, especially in Scandinavia, what Americans have to put up with is quite frankly mad. But even for those of them who do have good connections, the server routing across the entire country can be quite strange, and generally speaking, it's not uncommon for most American players to play around 60 or 70 ping in some places. So servers are definitely part of the equation, and connectivity is generally part of the equation. Now, Call of Duty actually recently reached out to me about my server video, and as part of my feedback, I said to them that they probably want to look into making issues with servers more apparent to players, showing them when something's going wrong with their connectivity, and making it more evidently clear. That can solve a lot of problems. But the second part is how Call of Duty's ballistic system is working going into Black Ops 6. This creates a huge amount of inconsistency that nobody's really talking about. I've covered it very briefly in a video before, but I think it's worth reiterating again. There are two things with Call of Duty's gunplay that, in my view, generally create a lot of inconsistency as to how people experience gunplay in Call of Duty. And they've actually been designed in such a way that they're there to create consistency and actually try and improve the situation from before. But I think the experience shift from Modern Warfare 3 and Modern Warfare 2 into something like Black Ops 6 has actually confused a lot of people in terms of how it works. Now, for those of you who are unaware, your bullet velocity in Call of Duty ties directly as to whether or not a weapon is hit scan or not hit scan at different ranges. So that's step number 1. If you fall outside of hit scan range on certain weapons with certain bullet velocities, take for example the Tanto with a 560 bullet velocity, the Tanto's bullet velocity means that it's only hit scan for about 28 meters. Anything past that point, it turns into a projectile with projectile-based values. So that means you're going from instant hit registration at 28 meters and below to registration that's being calculated to some extent that's projectile at 28 meters and above. Now, hypothetically, on good server systems with very few problems, this shouldn't cause too many issues. It can in Warzone, less so in a game like Black Ops 6, when distances between opponents are so small. The second part of the equation is how Call of Duty is treating headshot and body damage this year. Now, if you aren't aware of this, you really should be. Black Ops 6 does not care if you hit somebody anywhere but the head for the most part. Generally speaking, the neck, the chest, the head, the stomach, your arms, your lower legs, your toes, all share pretty much the same damage value. So it does not matter if you shoot somebody in the neck or the toe, for the most part the damage is the same. And that is the case for every single weapon in this game. If you hit somebody with a Tanto in the neck, it's 38 damage. If you hit them in the toe, it's 38 damage. And even if you do hit somebody in the head without equipping the headshot multiplier barrel, which also doesn't do a huge amount, the headshot multi is extremely low. It's 38 damage to the neck or chest, and it's 45 damage to the head for the Tanto. And that number can be even lower amongst certain other weapons like ARs and light machine guns. Now, the reason for this is because they're trying to flatten TTK values, and they're trying to make general TTK feel more consistent and make it generally a little bit better in terms of time to kill and time to death. And that is an entirely valid approach. The problem with this is that it completely strips away any conventional wisdom of any shooter over pretty much the last 2 to 3 decades. Right now, shooting somebody in the feet is as good as shooting them in the head for the most part, and the head isn't really a huge bonus. So spray and pray is the way to go for Black Ops 6, and there are lots of clips online that I've seen specifically of somebody shooting somebody in the legs and getting a kill over somebody who's shooting somebody in the chest and upper torso and maybe with the odd headshot. And the reason for this is that if you factor in how they're handling damage, how they're handling ballistics, and generally server problems for the most part, you just get an experience that doesn't feel very rewarding. Just on the basis of not really having a headshot multiplier alone, it does not matter if you shoot somebody in the feet. It is generally probably a more consistent way of killing somebody by aiming at center mass than it is by trying to aim for a smaller target. And that's a big problem. I know why Call of Duty is doing this, and I understand why they've taken this approach to make TTKs feel more consistent, and they have achieved that for the most part. But stripping back the conventional wisdom of headshots and feet shot not really mattering is kind of a big deal. Now, the arms having the same damage level as something like the chest and stomach makes sense, because when you're aiming at an opponent and their arms are up with their gun character and their character model generally, that makes sense, because if you shoot somebody in a chest-based area, you would expect the bullet to go through their arm and deal damage to their chest. That's fine. But the legs having the same damage model as the upper body entirely, to me, makes zero sense, and the head having such a small multiplier makes less sense. I generally feel as though headshots should count a lot more on certain weapon classes, like for example assault rifles, LMGs, etc., and should count less on close-range variants like SMGs. They seemingly have gone for a one-size-fits-all approach, and I just don't think it's working as well as they intended. Granted, I still think it's a good idea, and I think the overall goal of flattening time to kills and making it more consistent is genius, and I applaud them for doing that. But when somebody shoots you in the toes and does the same damage as somebody shooting you in the chest and the neck, that's inconsistent. That's inconsistent with first-person shooter design for pretty much the last 20 years, and it's going to create lots of infuriation and inconsistency on the internet, which is why this whole skill-based damage thing and conversation exists in the first place. So in terms of skill-based damage, we already have somewhat inconsistent servers at times, and people's own connections. I will say it isn't just Call of Duty who are at fault here. We also have the hit scan to a projectile-based bullet system, and then we have the fact that toe shots and chest shots are basically the same thing, and you can already see this big barrel of inconsistency that's building under Call of Duty for a system that they're actually trying to make quite consistent. But the last one, and the biggest one, and I think this creates the largest factor as to why people think skill-based damage exists, is how Call of Duty is handling time to kill. Now, this is a chart of the TTK of every single SMG in Black Ops 6. And next to it is a chart of every single SMG in something like Modern Warfare 3. And there's kind of a big difference here. And the big difference is the amount of plateauing allowed before damage range jumps. So in Black Ops 6, the difference between you doing 225 time to kill and 300 time to kill with something like the KSV is the difference between going from 10 meters to 11 meters. We're talking about an 80 millisecond jump in TTK, which is a visible jump to some extent, in the space of less than a meter. And this step ladders over and over again across a fairly short distance. You know, we're talking about damage changing effectively across the board in the space of 10 meters 3 or 4 different times. That's a really big deal. When you compare that to something like Modern Warfare 3, the damage range jumps, and then there's a fairly lengthy plateau of a good couple of meters, and then it jumps again, and then there's a plateau, and then it jumps again. Whereas in Black Ops 6, you're seeing this constant overlapping of different damage ranges that's changing very frequently in quite sharp instances. Now, this isn't necessarily a bad thing to some extent. It does make sense that these weapons are building unique damage profiles, and generally speaking, I would say that the feel of variety in Black Ops 6 is really, really good. But when you combine it with the fact that headshots don't matter, feet shots do, the fact that servers can be a little bit desyncy at times, and then you have this general new kind of damage range system that seems to zigzag a lot more than the previous one and doesn't have that sort of length of range, you get a system that can create a lot of inconsistency under the right conditions. And if you think I'm being dramatic about this, this is a player standing far away from me, and just guess how far he is. Cool, I'll ping him on the screen. He was nowhere near the distance you probably thought he was. The distances in-game in COD are wild, and if you ever want to test this yourself, just ping a random location on the floor. What looks to you what might be like 1 or 2 meters could be 3 or 4, or what looks like 3 or 4 could be 1 or 2. And you actually are a lot further away from things than you actually think you are. So to answer this age-old question, skill-based damage doesn't exist in COD, or at least not by my testing. And if I'm being perfectly frank with all of you, Call of Duty just about managed to get a fairly functional server system in place for one of the most played games in the world. The idea that they could then manipulate the data in between that is kind of lunacy. I mean, they're probably struggling as it is to make sure that things function properly. But generally, I think there are a couple of things in the Black Ops 6 space about how damage ranges are being handled, how headshots are being handled, that's creating this conversation online. People aren't talking about skill-based damage because they necessarily think the game is rigged. They're doing it because they're being shown instances in-game where things don't feel right. And if it's happening that frequently, then there's probably some work to be done. Now, I mentioned the whole distance thing, I mentioned the whole damage range thing, and you've also got to factor in now that people are now zipping around the map at the speed of light. When you take all of those 3 things together, 2 guys sliding past each other won't realize that they've gone from 10 meter damage range to 11 meter damage range during the duration of a gunfight. And this whole system can create some general problems. Now, I'm going to finish this video on a constructive note. I don't necessarily disagree with what a lot of Call of Duty is doing here. I actually think that they are doing some things that make a lot of sense in terms of trying to build a consistent experience. I just think certain things, like how damage ranges are currently working, and also how headshots and foot shots are currently working, need a little bit of addressing, because they go so far away from conventional wisdom and enter into the realm of fairly unconventional for a good purpose, that I think they're causing more harm than good, at least in terms of the perception of how their game is being played. That's about it from me, the Tactical Brick. Guys, if you enjoyed this deep dive, drop a like, please consider subscribing, it does help me out, and I'll see you again in the next one.